We're getting into the final stretch here, folks. What's up? I'm Phillip M. Bailey, and on this week's States of America, we're highlighting concerns over nationwide voter suppression. Speaker Nancy Pelosi taking heat for rejecting a corona relief deal. Which presidential candidate will actually protect your internet privacy? And Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page on whether Trump and Biden's dueling town halls better serve voters versus an actual debate. Let's go. Two people on the tip of Washington's tongue are Amy Coney Barrett and Nancy Pelosi. The first for her Supreme Court confirmation hearings, the other for her emphatic response to criticism she's received from her own party on the coronavirus stimulus package. My man Nick Wu, congressional reporter for USA Today, has joined us to talk about this. Nick, what's going on? Hey, let's start with Nancy Pelosi. Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She got into it with CNN's Wolf Blitzer. Give folks in the rest of the country an explanation of why Speaker Pelosi seemed to be on her heels and on the defensive about the coronavirus stimulus relief.
Well, so Speaker Pelosi got into this little dust up with Wolf Blitzer. As someone who's normally a very poised, unruffled person, because Blitzer kept on pressing Pelosi on why she wouldn't take the White House's deal for $1.8 trillion in coronavirus relief. Democrats have held fast on their plan for a $2.2 trillion plan that includes a number of provisions that Republicans don't like, including a larger unemployment boost, money for testing, and other provisions that are things that Democrats really want to have in there. And so that led to their dust up on, I believe it was Tuesday night, and this is where we are now.
I noticed Congressman Ro Khanna's criticism from California. He's often seen as the progressive voice of the Democratic caucus. Encapsulate for us real quick, Nick, what was his criticism of the plan? And does that indicate, is that a signal that the progressive caucus is bolting on Speaker Pelosi on this?
That's not really clear. There's only a couple members of Congress that have publicly criticized Pelosi's stance on this so far. Khanna tweeted and has gone on CNN to talk about why Pelosi should just take the deal now, and then if and when former Vice President Joe Biden is elected, to use that as a foundation for even more aid and stimulus. But most Democrats are pretty loath to actually publicly criticize the speaker. And Khanna, and I think maybe one other member, are the only people that I've seen say this publicly. Although, with an election only a few weeks away, going back to their constituents potentially empty-handed is something that weighs heavily on the minds of a lot of members of Congress.
Let's switch to Judge Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearings. We're seeing a lot of back and forth. This, to me, is more of a traditional, smooth sort of confirmation hearing, it seems like, at least to me, Nick, compared to Brett Kavanaugh, for example. Some people are criticizing her lack of responses, but aren't we often used to seeing Supreme Court nominees, whether they're more liberal-leaning or conservative-leaning judges, not really answer the questions and often say, that's for the political branches, I'm not really interested in answering those questions? How would you describe this week's confirmation hearings?
That's very true, Philip. I mean, the Supreme Court and its justices like to see themselves as above the fray of what they see as like kind of petty partisan politics. So this week, a number of Democratic senators tried to really nail down Judge Barrett on hot button issues, especially those involving the president. They'd ask it generically. What if a president refused to commit to a peaceful transfer of power? Or do you think white supremacy is bad? And Judge Barrett, except on the white supremacy question, generally dodged these questions and said that she either wouldn't answer hypotheticals or get into partisan politics, even on a question on whether she thought climate change was caused by people.
Right. I mean, some of those questions by Democrats struck me, Nick, as, sort of gotcha questions, right? I mean, I don't know what the Supreme Court would have to do with some of those questions. I guess maybe it's more about getting her sort of philosophical outlook. One thing that struck me was her comments about, Judge Barrett has, I believe, 2 adopted children who are African-American, who are Black children. And she talked about the George Floyd incident in Minnesota where he was killed by police, and saying that, she sort of commiserated with her daughter about that.
Given, as we just talked about, the George Floyd video, that racism persists in our country. But
what was interesting was that, it seems to be that conservatives, Republicans are really going on a charm offensive with Judge Barrett, accentuating her Catholic background, her Catholic faith, her family, her adoption, sort of her wholesome family image, whereas Democrats are trying to sort of use her past rulings. For example, on that George Floyd comment, I did see a lot of Democrats pointing out that in one of Judge Barrett's rulings, I believe in a case in Illinois, she ruled that a Black plaintiff could not necessarily prove that being called the N-word created a hostile work environment. Are we seeing either one of these tactics breaking through here? Republicans with their charm offensive and Democrats trying to do more of this, let's attack her record and get her on the record on some of these more controversial political issues? Who's winning in this sort of back and forth?
That's a good point. I mean, Democrats very early on took anything in Barrett's personal background off the table, be it her religion, her affiliation with past groups, and the like. So what they've really been trying to nail her down on, and really these attacks kind of bounced off her, are to try to ask about these hot button issues. You know, the racial discrimination cases, these hypotheticals about a president, doing certain things. And whereas Republicans have brought up parts of Barrett's background, really praised her credentials that she's bringing to the table. We're on the final day of confirmation hearings right now.
Right.
Where we're hearing from a parade of character witnesses who, from Democrats, are talking about what Barrett could mean for the Affordable Care Act and abortion, and Republican witnesses who have worked with Barrett or can otherwise speak to the kind of character that she would bring to the court. And I mean, the outcome here is all pretty much preordained.
Right.
It's just a question of how this is going to play out once voters go to the polls in a little under 3 weeks.
Well, what is the consequence? I know Senator Ted Cruz of Texas all but basically said this is a shoo-in. She's going to be confirmed by the Judiciary Committee, and she'll be confirmed by the full Senate. But conservatives are definitely in a branding operation, even calling her ACB. Nick, one final question. We definitely saw Republicans who were antsy about attacks on Judge Barrett's faith, her Catholic faith, by Democrats during these hearings. Did we see that? Did we see any Democrats really being hostile towards her Catholic faith in these confirmation hearings?
Yeah, they really haven't touched on that at all. Democrats, like I said, took pains early on to take anything in her background off the table. Senator Dick Durbin, the second-ranking Senate Democrat, said that he did not know of any Democrats that had planned to do so, and we really haven't seen that emerge in any of the questioning. What we have seen, of course, are there are some protesters outside the Senate office buildings where her confirmation are being held. That some have protested elements of her background. You see people in handmade costumes and the like, but those are outside groups. It's not the lawmakers that are talking about any of this.
I have seen some of those theatrics as well. You're right about that. Well, definitely thank you for that conversation, Nick Wu, congressional reporter for USA Today. As always, thanks for joining us on States of America, my man.
For sure. Thanks, Phil.
Coming up next on States of America, the new Jim Crow, voter suppression efforts in Texas, Georgia, and Arizona with Nicquel Terry Ellis.
The state has not or has failed to address what is causing these long lines, what is causing these computer glitches.
Long voting lines, limited drop-off ballot boxes, and reductions in physical polling places. It isn't your grandfather's poll tax, but all of this has ignited cries of voter suppression in states such as Arizona, Texas, and Georgia amid the 2020 election. Someone who knows the ins and outs of this story is my colleague, Nicquel Terry Ellis, national correspondent for USA Today. Nicquel, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Phil.
Let me ask you first and foremost, we're seeing an unprecedented amount of long lines, particularly like in Georgia, right? What do you think this means to have so many long lines and people trying to vote?
I think it sort of speaks to the significance of this election and how historic it is and how people are seeing how much is at stake with the pandemic, with the national reckoning on racism, with the economy suffering. I just think folks are really just energized and wanting to get out there and vote, and they see that elections have consequences. And when you don't vote and the country is not in the state that you want it to be in, you've sort of given up your voice in that. And I think people are seeing how important it is to have a voice in these elections, especially in 2020.
What is it about Texas, Georgia, and Arizona in particular? My political brain tells me it's this. Democrats are very hopeful to flip these states. It looks like Arizona in particular. Why did your piece focus on those three states and scare tactics or efforts to suppress the vote there?
Because these states, Georgia, Arizona, and Texas, have not traditionally been Democratic blue states. They have been reliably red states for many years. And I think sort of with that, you're seeing that in the polls, the race between Trump and Biden is tightening in these states. And I think it's kind of surprising because people don't really expect that. They expect for Trump to easily win Texas, Trump to easily win Georgia and Arizona. Those have always been sure wins for Republicans for so long. But I think the last poll average showed that Biden was leading in Arizona by 2.7 points. These margins are tight for states that are, like I said, reliably red Republican states. And so I think what the issue is that when you have voter suppression, people are saying, well, you see that these states are now have a growing Latino population in Texas and Arizona, and the
Right.
Black population in Georgia is growing as well. More people of color means more votes for Democrats. So I think the criticism is that when you have voter suppression tactics like you're seeing in these states, that it feels as though you're trying to suppress those Democratic votes.
Yeah, you haven't seen a Democrat win the presidential race in Texas since 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected. What are some of the tactics that we're seeing, that you're seeing in your reporting that are being deployed in Texas, Arizona, Georgia? Are they different?
Yeah, I think there are some similarities. I think overall, people feel as though these voting rights activists feel as though the states are pulling or putting tactics out there to make it harder for people of color to vote. I think in Georgia, for example, you see that there are longer lines at majority Black polling places, but when you go across town to affluent white polling places, the lines are shorter and folks are in and out in 15 minutes. I waited in line for 3.5 hours, for 3.5 hours to vote on Tuesday.
Wow.
And I know that other voters waited up to 10 hours to vote. And a lot of these long waits were in Black communities. And I think folks are feeling as though the state has not or has failed to address what is causing these long lines, what is causing these computer glitches in these majority Black polling places. In Arizona, I mean, there have been laws that have put in place to make it a crime for someone to assist you with your ballot, to collect your ballot for you and drop it off for you. They made it a crime for that. They're making it harder for people who have dual residences, students who maybe live in Arizona for part of the year and then live somewhere else for the other part of the year when they're not in school. Just all of the stops have been pulled out by these states to make it harder for people to vote. And in Texas, we saw just in the last week the controversy over the state's governor mandating only one ballot box for absentee ballots per county, which poses a hardship for people who are now having to travel farther to drop off their mail-in ballot. And we know that a lot of people who are voting absentee or mail-in, they can't afford to stand in line or take off work to go vote. Like they have to vote by absentee or mail-in ballot. And this affects people of color at a higher rate.
One thing your stories pointed out was the closing of polling places. I believe 320 reported alone in Arizona, around 700 in Texas. How do you define voter suppression, right? Is it a lack of polling places? Is it all the difficulties you mentioned before? Is it in the eyes of the beholder? Basically, Nikhil, I'm asking you the question of, where does the responsibility of the voter end and where does the government's responsibility to provide the most access begin?
I think the government's responsibility is to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to vote. And when you put laws in place that make it difficult for folks to vote, especially when you're seemingly targeting communities of color, it feels like you're trying to suppress those people from voting. And so that's sort of what the perception is by a lot of voters and voting rights activists, that, this is the government's responsibility to, make it so that I can go to my polling place and feel, comfortable and feel like I can trust the election process, that there's integrity, when I go and cast my ballot and that I'm not being forced to stand in a long line. I think all of those issues, make people feel as though they are being challenged when it comes to voting, which is a right that everyone should be afforded.
Well, Nicquel Terry Ellis, national correspondent for USA Today and a stellar member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Phil.
Coming up next on States of America, a question from you, the viewers, on where does Joe Biden and Donald Trump stand on big tech and your privacy?
Would you consider taxing this data in hopes to limit the amount of data collected?
States of America is focusing on where the candidates stand on the topics that mean the most to you. Today, we got a question from Trace in Minnesota on big tech and your privacy.
I'm Trace Ludwig from Blaine, Minnesota, and I would like to know what candidates think about regulating big tech companies and the mining and sale of personal user data. Would you consider taxing this data in hopes to limit the amount of data collected? Thank you.
First, let's take a look at ex-VP Joe Biden. In an interview with the New York Times' editorial board, Biden said, quote, "We should be setting standards not unlike the Europeans are doing relative to privacy." By that, Biden's alluding to GDPR, a European regulation giving people more say in how their personal data is processed and used. Meanwhile, President Trump in 2017 signed a bill that gives less protection to internet users. Essentially, companies like Verizon or Comcast don't have to seek your permission to use, process, or even sell your data. Now, Trace, going back to your big tech tax question, given their positions, it doesn't seem there's currently consideration for a tax to discourage big tech's data collection. Thanks for the question, though, and we'll continue to keep an eye on this and other issues in 2020. Check back with us in about a week. Last but certainly not least on States of America, our very own Susan Page on what the last presidential debate could mean for the 2020 presidential election.
Trump could be great, Biden could be terrible, could have repercussions. I know that we'll all be watching.
This week, former Vice President Joe Biden and President Donald Trump have dueling town halls on rival TV networks at that. But does this best serve voters? Here to discuss is Susan Page, our very own Washington bureau chief, who's coming fresh off of moderating the vice presidential debate. Susan, thanks for coming back.
Hey, Philip, it's great to be with you again.
Susan, let me ask you first and foremost, I have to, as an admirer of yours for years, how do you feel after that debate? You're certainly under the spotlight along with the two candidates who are on the stage. Just give me a sense of how you feel coming out of that monumental, sort of important national discussion.
I feel relieved. It was a big honor to do. I was thrilled to have the opportunity. Worked hard on it with some of my USA Today colleagues to shape the questions. Thought it went pretty well, not perfectly, but I was pleased with the way it went and proud of it. And now I'm glad that it's over. I've never before spoken to an audience of 58 million people.
Right. I was going to say that was, I was certainly watching as everyone else was. One other question I had about that was, I noticed that Kristen Welker was supposed to be doing the third debate, right? She's taken herself off of social media, sort of removed herself. I know you had a similar strategy. Why was that important as a moderator to do?
Well, I didn't want there to be questions raised about a comment I made that might have seemed biased to someone or tilted in one way or another, because I try to always be straight down the middle. And the easiest way to avoid any kind of misunderstanding was to stop talking. So after I was announced to be the moderator of the vice presidential debate, I went off Twitter for a month. It was actually kind of refreshing. I stopped writing stories for USA Today. I just focused on the task at hand. And I think that Kristen has tried to do just about the same thing, especially when it comes to social media.
Let me ask you, we're going into, I think Biden's going to be on ABC, Trump's on NBC. Having these dueling town halls, right? For me, I guess the question is, do these dueling town halls serve voters in the same way that having them together in one town hall would have done?
I love having candidates do town halls because it is easier for a candidate, for a politician, to refuse to answer a question from a journalist than it is for them to refuse to answer a question from a voter, from a citizen. So I'm glad they're doing town halls, but it's not the same as a debate. It's not a chance to see the two candidates side by side. You don't see them interacting with one another. You don't get to take the kind of the measure of them in quite the same way. So I think debates are invaluable. I'm sorry that the town hall debate that was scheduled for Thursday night fell through, and I'm looking forward to that final debate next week.
What impact do you think that October 22nd debate will have? And do you think, most important question, it will be different than the first presidential debate with Chris Wallace. Do you think President Trump may tame himself a little bit and not interrupt as much?
On the one hand, this debate next Thursday in Nashville is the biggest opportunity to shake up a race. It is going to be the biggest moment between now and Election Day to change the way things are heading. But that said, it is a little late for an October surprise. You know, more than 10 million Americans have already voted. We've never had so many Americans vote so early. This is a reflection of the pandemic that we're still in the middle of. The other reason I think that it may have less impact than debates might customarily have is that attitudes about President Trump have been pretty much sealed in concrete for about 4 years. And so some people love him, some people hate him. Most people, the overwhelming majority of Americans have made up their minds one way or another. And that makes the debate have less impact. That said, could have a big moment. Trump could be great. Biden could be terrible, could have repercussions. I know that we'll all be watching.
If you had a chance to be the advisor, the person in President Trump's ear or former Vice President Biden's ear before the October 22nd debate, what advice would you give them and why?
I'm sure no one will take my advice, but I do think it is their last best chance to make their closing argument to voters, to speak directly to Americans and say, this is why you should entrust me with this very important job, this job that affects you and your families in such fundamental ways. That's what this debate could do. And so maybe look both at what they say at the very beginning and what they say at the very end.
Is there a topic, Susan, that you think hasn't been brought up thus far in either the vice presidential or the one presidential debate that we've had that American voters are yearning to hear? Is there a particular issue, or maybe it's climate change? I know you brought up climate change during the vice presidential debate. Is there any particular issue that just hasn't, because there's only so much time, right? Even with an hour and 30 minutes with no commercials between the two debates. Is there anything that you're hearing from voters and readers that they want to hear about these two candidates address more than anything else?
Well, you know, I had been intended to do 9 topics of about 10 minutes each. I ran out of time, had to drop the 9th topic. We only did 8 at the vice presidential debate. The topic that I dropped was immigration. And that was also a topic that was not dealt with in the first presidential debate. Immigration has animated President Trump's supporters from the point he announced he was going to run for president 5 years ago. So I think that's an important issue. And, you know, I heard from a lot of Americans with a whole series of issues that they wanted me to ask about, like LGBTQ rights. That was one I got a lot of messages about, childcare, education. There are a lot of big issues that we haven't talked about yet in the debates. One reason for that, COVID-19 is issue number 1. And that's really been the thread through a lot of the conversation in both of the debates we've had so far.
Well, Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today and moderator extraordinaire, thanks for joining us here on States of America.
Hey, thanks, Phillip.
All right, everyone, thanks for joining us on States of America, where we have honest conversations on the issues that matter most.